Recently, I was browsing through my Facebook feed, and two of my Facebook friends who have no relationship to each other whatsoever both posted pictures from the Roman ruins of Pompeii within 15 minutes of each other. I thought maybe they're on the same cruise ship. And then one of them responded, "No, I hate cruises. I would never be on a cruise ship." So it really is a total coincidence that they happen to be at the Roman ruins of Pompeii at the same time. I don't know the odds of that with all the people I know and all the places in the world they could be visiting, that they would happen to be at the same place at the same time. If all the gin joints in all the world, how could this happen? We don't know. Of course, some sites get more visits than others. There are times where in Venice, the locals don't want to go into town. If a cruise ship shows up, they make themselves scarce because the tourists are overwhelming. But there are also off the beaten path locations that you can visit that are maybe harder to get to, that are maybe less well traveled, that have had less famous people come from them or less famous people go to them. And, sometimes those are the most interesting sites and you get the most attention. When we were in Mexico last year, actually it was last Jewish year, but earlier this calendar year, we were visiting a town called San Miguel de Allende. And there is a ruin there from the Mesoamerican culture that lived in the area that is fantastically beautiful. And we were the only people there. So we got a private tour, and it was isolated and abandoned, and it was fascinating. It was not quite on the scale of some of the larger ruins, but it was big enough for us, and it was great. So that off the beaten path option sometimes is really fascinating. Now, in southern Poland, there is a small town that has an ancient synagogue that's been recently restored from, I think ancient, from the 1700s. So certainly several centuries. It had an active Jewish community. It even had a famous Hasidic Rebbe at one time. The town in Polish is called Oświęcim. Now, when you hear the name Oświęcim, it might not mean very much to you. But if you heard the town's name in German, it's Auschwitz. And that means quite a bit. This is one of the challenges in Jewish travel. Am I going to see how Jews lived? Or am I going to be reminded that the Jews aren't there anymore, and why? What percent of Americans have a passport? Do you have a guess? It's actually 56%. But it's very different depending on where you live. If you live in urban settings, or actually urban suburbs, is much higher. It's like 64% of people there have passports. But if you live in the African-American South or in rural communities, it could be in the 30s of how many people. Actually, Brown's guess of 23% isn't represented demographically by a particular type of area. Everything is at least 30% or higher. But there's a clear difference between 30% and 60%. Some Americans are very open to traveling internationally. Others are less so. Now, I couldn't find a breakdown of what percent of Jews have passports. I don't know. My guess is the number is relatively high because we know the story of the wandering Jew, right? And sometimes we wander back to where we wandered from. We go back to the old country. We go back to see where our people used to live, or we go to places that aren't part of our Jewish story, but are part of the Jewish story writ large. It's more accurate, actually, to call us not the the wandering Jew. We're the migrating Jews, because we could stay in the same place for a long time if things were stable. The problem was they were often unstable, and then we had to leave. So that's why we moved. But we migrated periodically, not wandering all the time just for the sake of wandering. We built buildings. We put down roots. We definitely had the desire for broader horizons, but the human natural behavior of staying put, if that's possible. I remember in England, they found an ancient skeleton from 7,000 years ago. And just for curiosity, they tested the DNA of current residents of the nearby town compared to the DNA of the skeleton. And it turns out they hit a match of a direct line male descendant from that ancient skeleton to modern times. He happened to be a history teacher, which is a nice coincidence. And so on one level, you think, how fascinating that he has this family tree with this big gap, but he has someone way back then. But it also makes you think, his family hasn't moved in 6,000 years? That seems not part of the Jewish experience. So we certainly migrated if we had to, but if we didn't have to, we stayed put. The Jews in Baghdad could trace their roots back to before the Muslim conquest of the Middle East, to before the year zero. Some of them claimed roots going back to the Babylonian exile in 500 BCE. And they had been there in some capacity from 500 BCE through conquest, disaster, and everything else, all the way into the 20th century. Or you think about the Romaniot Jews based in Greek islands and in Rome, who claimed roots back to 2,000 years before, whether it was the Roman conquest or it was the migration of Jews within the Roman Empire. Now, you have an example in Eastern Europe as well, in the town of Krakow in Poland, where Jews lived for over 600 years, from around the year 1300 is some of the earliest records we can find, all the way until the Holocaust. So when you're deciding where to go in Jewish life, you have a choice. You can move to where Jews lived, or you can move to where Jews live today. Now, there are a lot of factors in deciding where you want to go on your Jewish vacation. You might choose a heritage tour. You want to go back to the old country where your family is from. Many Jewish family names come from towns or places. And so you know your family went through there, or at least one side of it at some point in your past, and maybe you want to go back and see what the town is like today. Maybe you can find an old cemetery. And maybe, just maybe, you can find a headstone and do a rubbing with your family name represented from centuries before. Now, there are a lot of other factors you have to factor in as well. There's how much does it cost to get there? How easy is it to get there? Oswiecim is actually relatively difficult to get to. I have a former professor of mine who taught a class on the Holocaust. His father was a Holocaust survivor from Poland, and he went back with his father in the 1980s to visit the area, and into the train station came a train with the word Oswiecim on the train. And he had to get on the train to Auschwitz. But that was the only way to really get there. So some people factor in carbon footprints, environmental considerations, the ethics of traveling as well. Are you exploiting the local population, or are you helping them? Often people make choices based on what else is interesting that they can see. It's Jewish tourism, sure, but maybe I want to go to the beach, or maybe I want to see a general history museum. I had a fantastic 10th anniversary trip I took with my wife to Iceland, not to investigate the Jewish history of Iceland, but to experience Iceland. Except I do have a Jewish history of Iceland because my father was stationed in Iceland in the 1950s when he was in the army from 52 to 54, and he stayed on an Air Force base named Keflavik, which today is the major airport that we flew into and flew out of. So for me, ironically, Iceland was a Jewish heritage tour, even if for most Jews it's not. So you have a lot of things to choose from. And when I was working at the Birmingham Temple 20 years ago, Sherwin Wine, who was one of our founding rabbis in our movement, used to take these fantastic vacations every July. He would work very hard 11 months of the year, and then July he would vanish for a whole month. And he would go somewhere wonderfully exotic in the world. And then in August, he would come back and tell us about his summer vacation. And this was not the proverbial, your uncle sits you down for a 3-hour slideshow. These were fascinating tours of fascinating places. He would talk about his trip to Timbuktu, literally to Timbuktu in Africa. He went and took the Trans-Siberian Railway all the way across Asia and Russia and included a stop in the Yiddish speaking Jewish autonomous territory in Siberia called Birobidzhan that Stalin founded in the 1930s and still has Yiddish signs on the street names. He went to Rome many times because he loves history. In the army, when he was a chaplain, he had served in Korea and loved it. So he had wonderful stories of long distance trips and exploring the world. Sometimes Jewish heritage, for sure. I don't know how much Jewish heritage there is in Timbuktu. It didn't matter for him. It was exploring the human experience. And as an aside, if you're curious for some of those trip talks that he gave, we actually set up a tribute website for Sherwin Wine many years ago that is called sherwinwine.com. And if you look on there, there's a whole set of articles, but also audio talks on all varieties of parts of the world. So if you wanted to see what he had to say on Eastern Europe, you go to Eastern Europe, and then you'll find the audio page, and it'll pull up all the talks he gave on Warsaw, Ukraine, Krakow, Lithuania, the experience of the shtetl, Vilna, and many of these cities are places that he had visited over his time. Now, one of the challenges that we have today is that the motivation for a heritage tour can be, we'll say, complicated, because we sometimes just want to get the facts, and that's wonderful. But there are lots of ways that you could learn facts, of course. You could simply read a book. You could hear a lecture. You could watch a video. You can even do now virtual tours run by drone cameras and people walking around creating 3D images of spaces. You don't have to leave your couch to experience the world if you don't want to. That's just the facts. But we do these heritage tours, we do Jewish tourism also because of emotions. If it's a family heritage, if it's seeing the scene of a terrible tragedy, you know, if you go to a Holocaust site, a concentration camp, a memorial site, a monument that was built, you know, those are designed and they are chosen for visits because of the emotions attached. It's not simply the facts that we're experiencing. One of the other reasons why we love traveling to experience these pieces is that it's a full sensory experience. You're not just seeing pictures. You're hearing, you're smelling, you're talking to people, you're tasting the foods, you know. That makes a big difference. And it also creates the opportunity for deeply powerful moments. When I was leading a trip to Israel in 2019, we visited an ancient synagogue that had been built in the first few centuries of the Common Era. It had lasted for a couple hundred years and then had been covered up by earthquake and other kind of disasters and forgotten. It was rediscovered in the 1990s. And it has been cleared out and restored as best as possible. But the synagogue was fascinating. The mosaics were fascinating. But the most meaningful moment of that whole visit was that we had to leave early because they had to set up the chairs for a bar mitzvah that was taking place in that synagogue later that day. That this synagogue from 1,500 years ago was now being used again for Jewish religious ceremony. That was amazing. I've often talked at Kol Hadash in the past about the experience of visiting the Western Wall in the old city of Jerusalem and feeling how smooth the stones were because of all the people that have touched those stones over the centuries. Again, that's something you can't get by looking at a picture or reading a book. And for some people, the traveling is about meeting people. It's not just the landscape, it's the people too. There's a wonderful Yehuda Amichai poem we've used at Kol Hadash in the past, where he says that the redemption will come when people pay attention to the people and not the architecture. Flip it around. Pay no attention to that Roman arch. Look at the person sitting on the steps with vegetables he bought to bring home for his family. That's redemption, Amichai speculates. Now, there are three kinds of where Jews lived cities. There are those with a mostly invisible Jewish presence these days. These are cities that used to have lots of Jews, but today have almost none, and the people in charge haven't really cared to preserve the heritage. So, as I mentioned, Jews lived in Baghdad for over 2,000 years, 2,500 years, but they were unceremoniously expelled from Baghdad in 1949 and 1950. They had most of their property taken from them. They had been sort of the commercial and intellectual elite in the city of Baghdad, where most Iraqi Jews lived. And after the founding of the state of Israel, because of the hostility of the Iraqi government and people to Israel and to Jews more generally, the Jews in Baghdad had to flee, and they fled with almost nothing. And the powers that be had no interest in preserving that heritage, and so they didn't. They repurposed buildings for something else, and of course, the destruction of the wars in Iraq and the terrorism and so on have only made it harder to find what was there. And another example, this is one I've never visited, but I found really fascinating and actually spoke about at the High Holidays some years ago, is a town on the eastern edge of Greece called Thessaloniki in Greece. But the Jews who lived there always called it Salonika. And Salonika was part of the Ottoman Empire for many centuries, and it had a huge population of Sephardic Jews that spoke medieval Spanish written in Hebrew letters called Judesmo or Ladino. In fact, the Sephardic Jews were the dominant group in the town. They were 40% of the population, or 45% of the population. Then there were about 35% that were Greeks, and another 20% or so who were Muslims or other populations. So the Jews were the largest single group in the population. They ran the ports. They were in charge of much of the commercial activity. In fact, the port of Salonika shut down on Shabbat because all the schleppers, all the porters were Sephardic Jews who refused to work on Shabbat. And so the port was closed on Friday night and Saturday day. And so if you were shipping to Salonika, you knew don't arrive on a Friday because you might not get your goods unloaded and then you'll have a problem. The criminals were Sephardic Jews too, by the way. It wasn't all, sweetness and light, but it was a really lived Jewish experience with the Jewish population as the dominant population. They had been there for centuries. Since the expulsion from Spain, many of them landed there, welcomed in by the Ottoman Empire. They had a huge historic cemetery that was outside of the walls of what had been the old city. But by the 1940s, the city had grown and grown and grown. Large numbers of Greek refugees from the Ottoman Empire that fled in a population transfer when most of the Ottomans left Greece and went back to Turkey, and most of the Greeks living on the Greek city-states along the coast left Turkey and went back to Greece. In that population exchange, now you had almost no Turks. The Jews were now a minority, and a small minority in the population, 10%, 20%. And so they didn't have the power they had before. Their cemetery was now in prime real estate. And you're going to use it for a Jewish cemetery as the city grows and grows. Of course, the tragedy of Salonika is the tragedy of European Jewry. Greece was invaded by the German army. The Jews of Salonika were ultimately rounded up and deported out to Auschwitz, and only 1,000 or 2,000 managed to survive their imprisonment, persecution, and slaughter. What happened to that cemetery? Well, after the Jews were gone, the cemetery was dismantled. The tombstones were reused for paving stones or for other construction needs. And after the war, the newly installed Greek government, post-liberation, decided that Thessaloniki was a large city. It needed a university. And so they built the University of Thessaloniki where the Jewish historic cemetery had been. There isn't even a marker or a plaque on that university that tells you what used to be there. The monument to the memorial of the Jews of Salonika, there's a museum of their history in the city, and there's a monument to the destruction on the road to the airport. But it's not part of the site where their life and where their death and their memory was rooted. That's one example of an option. You could go to a site where the Jewish presence is mostly invisible. A second option is you could go to a Jewish historic site that has almost no historic Jews there, but they might still have the monuments and the sites. You can go, if you could get into Iran, there's a lot of Jewish sites in Iran because there was a substantial Jewish presence there, even if there are very few Jews left in Iran today. You could go visit small-town Jewish life in America and in other places where there were Jewish communities of 30 families, 50 families, 70 families that built small synagogues, that had their cemeteries. And then over the course of time, the kids moved out, the communities died out, but the buildings are still there, the memories are still there. And the third option, if you don't want to go where there's not a lot of Jewish presence left or where there's Jewish presence but not a lot of Jews, is you could go someplace where there historically was a large number of Jews, and now there's a small number of Jews left. So there used to be tens of thousands of Jews in Morocco. Now there's maybe 10,000 Jews in Morocco. There used to be hundreds of thousands of Jews in Istanbul. Now there are tens of thousands of Jews in Istanbul. The historic sites may still be there to visit, the old synagogues and the marketplaces and the residences, the old cemeteries, but the numbers just aren't there as much as they used to be. We ran a trip some years ago to Savannah and Charleston, both for the American history of Savannah and Charleston, but also the Jewish history of Savannah and Charleston. Two of the oldest Jewish congregations in the country were founded in Savannah and in Charleston because they were port cities and they were major hubs of commerce and of intellectual discourse. Charleston was called the city of churches because there were so many different varieties of religious communities there, including Jews who were welcomed in and who felt rooted there. One of the historic synagogues in Charleston has a wonderful stained glass display of the history of the community, which includes a soldier in a Confederate uniform, because the Jews were proud of their service as citizens of the city of Charleston and of the state of South Carolina, and they fought for the Confederacy. That was part of who they were. Now, there are still Jewish communities in Savannah, in Charleston. They're much smaller than they used to be. But I was struck by one detail in the synagogue in Savannah, which, by the way, looks like a church because it was designed by people who designed churches, and they wanted to blend in with the people around them. But in this synagogue, they have stained glass inserts with the names of the rabbis who have been there. And what I found striking about that was that every rabbi that came there stayed there for 30 or 40 years, and they had very few flameouts. You know, somebody who shows up and then doesn't work for a year or two. So it really was amazing, the longevity of the rabbis, but also the stability of the congregation. Now, if you've ever visited Savannah, it's a beautiful, wonderful city. So I can imagine from the rabbi's perspective why they wouldn't want to go anywhere else. You know, once you get there, you'll want to stay. Now, there is a fourth option these days that came to prominence after the pandemic, and that is that you can go somewhere without going anywhere. If you can't get people to the site, then maybe you take the site to the people instead. And I can show you one example of this. In Israel, there's a beautiful museum called the Israel Museum. And in that museum, they've reconstructed synagogues that used to exist somewhere else. Here's a picture from that trip to Israel of the vaulted ceiling of one of the wooden synagogues in Europe that managed to survive, that was taken apart and brought back to Israel to be rebuilt in the Israel Museum, so that you can see some of the beautiful paintings, the artwork, the Hebrew writing on the walls. This dates back several centuries, but it survives and it's able to be seen because it was moved to somewhere else. You could take a virtual reality tour of the historic synagogue in Aleppo at the Israel Museum. You put on some goggles and you can walk around a space that's been designated for it. This synagogue, by the way, is rubble right now, you know, because of what happened to Aleppo during the Syrian civil war. But it survives in images and in the memories of the people who were there by the use of technology. Or as one other example, I discovered today that the Museum of the Jewish People has an exhibit. This is based in Tel Aviv. It has a virtual exhibit called Synagogues 360. And in this synagogue virtual tour, you can choose by design if you want to see Art Deco synagogues or modern architecture or exciting examples, illustrated walls and ceilings. And so you click on, let's take a look at the tours that are options. There are 10 different synagogues here. And then once you're in one of the synagogues, now you can simply rotate around, see what the synagogue looked like, all of the decorations that are there. It has some details. This is a synagogue in Toronto, in Canada, that is an Orthodox Ashkenazi synagogue built in 1911. There are some pictures of the exterior there as well, and of course, this virtual tour. Then you go to the next one. And this is the Boskovice synagogue. This is in the Czech Republic. It's a Moravian-style building. It's an Orthodox as well, also Ashkenazi. And again, you can see how the walls are decorated very differently. The bima looks different. The walls have more writing on them. You have the candelabras. There's fewer benches and more open space for standing. So again, you could travel and see, you can zoom in and zoom out. You can see dozens of synagogues virtually without leaving your couch or without even putting your pants on. So there are so many opportunities for exploring where Jews were, even if they aren't there in great numbers anymore. And so that category is unlimited. But let's say you want to go see Jewish communities that are around today. Where would you go? Well, let's take a guess at which cities have the largest Jewish populations today. If you want to go see as many live Jews as possible, where might you go? So David commented New York, that's one option. That's in the top 10 for sure. Paris, Buenos Aires also might have a substantial Jewish population. Sydney's a possibility. Okay, so those are some guesses for where there are lots of Jews. Los Angeles might have a large number of Jews for sure. So I have a list actually of the top 15 Jewish communities in the world. So let me pull that up. Here we go. Metropolitan areas with Jewish populations over 100,000. Number one is Tel Aviv. We didn't even think of any Jewish cities in Israel, but of course, those have a large population of Jews. Understandable. You have New York City as number two in the larger metro area. This is a metro area calculation that has 2.1 million. You've got also Jerusalem and Haifa. Again, you're going to have large Jewish populations in Israel. The next is Los Angeles, about 600,000. Miami, greater South Florida area. Philadelphia is number 7. Paris is number 8, 300 and some thousand. The Washington, D.C. area is number 9. And the Chicago area writ large, including Northwest Indiana and Southern Wisconsin, counts as the 10th largest Jewish city. Boston is number 11. Beersheba in Israel is number 12. San Francisco is number 13. London is 14, and Buenos Aires is 15. Now, some people might want to take a tour of Miami for the Jewish heritage side. There's actually a fascinating Jewish heritage museum in Miami that used to be what they called the Gangster Synagogue. You can see Meyer Lansky's name on one of the stained glass windows because he donated the money to get it put up there. So there are interesting histories in all of these cities, but most people, when they think about Jewish tourism, don't think about going to Los Angeles or going to Washington, D.C., or going to Chicago. They think of general tourism in those areas, but maybe not Jewish tourism. We think of the more exotic places because, again, we're focused more on the Jewish past than the Jewish present. I'll also point out, you'll notice one of the columns here details what percent of the metro area is Jewish in each of these cities. Understandably, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, these are substantially Jewish populations. But the highest number now is New York, which is about 10%, 11% Jewish. And all the other cities are a lower percent. The Miami, South Florida area is about 8.7%. The Chicago area is only 3% Jewish. San Francisco, 5%. Buenos Aires is only 1%. London, 2%. Paris, 3%. So a very small proportion of the city is represented by its Jewish population because these are gigantic cities. If you went back historically, though, here's a listing of the Jews in Warsaw, Lodz in Poland, Budapest, Vienna, and Berlin. And notice what percent of the total population of the city they are. In Berlin, they were in the 3, 4, 5% as you go through history. In Vienna, though, they were around 10% as late as 1929. In Budapest, they were 20% of the city in 1925. In Lodz, they were 32% of the city in 1929. And in Warsaw, the last date here, they were 33%. A full third of the city of Warsaw was Jewish. Imagine what Jewish tourism to see living Jews was like in those eras. The closest we get today is going to the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in New York. Or if you go to Israel, visiting these deeply Jewish communities, both secular liberal Jews and Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods. So you can do a living tour if you want. And we've done living tours too. We ran a tour to Philadelphia some years ago. And it was a really fascinating tour because we learned about not just the Jewish history of Philadelphia and the American history of Philadelphia, of course, looking at Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell and those kind of sites, but we also saw what Jewish life was like even today. Now, is this a synagogue? It looks like a Moorish kind of temple, but it is in fact a Reform synagogue in the classical Reform style of the 1910s to 20s, built in a very large monumental style. Look at the height of those arches, over the doors on the way in at the main ceremonial entrance. This is the inside of the sanctuary. Again, look at the scale of how big it is. They actually rope off back rows because the building is so big, it would feel like you're lost in a cathedral. And this was actually modeled on the one of the main cathedrals in Venice and the main synagogue in Venice and in Florence, I think was the other place that helped to inform the architecture for this. Look at the gilded arches. And in fact, the rabbis historically would sit on those chairs way in the back, high up on the bima, very far removed from the congregation. And they built, notice how they have this portable podium here. The rabbis want to be closer now than they were 80 years ago. They wanted to be more ceremonial. So even the architecture and how it functions has changed over the years. Here again, you can see the vaulted dome roof of that same sanctuary, the balcony. And this looks like a huge cathedral. This is a synagogue and a very popular synagogue. Here again, a picture of the archway. This is an Orthodox synagogue that we visited. Not particularly new, not particularly old, it's relatively new, but the congregation is one of the oldest continuously active congregations in North America. They argue with New York over who is the oldest. Mikveh Israel is the name of this particular community. And then we had the chance to visit the only synagogue designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous American Prairie-style architect. The synagogue is in fact designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and like most of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, it leaks. When we went in to visit it, there had kiddie pools set aside in the sanctuary because of the leaks that were coming through. Frank Lloyd Wright was a visionary designer, not the best technical architect when it came to functionality and the problem of leaky roofs. But you can see the design is, very striking, and inside just as much. Here's the sanctuary, and you can notice they have this beautiful hanging light over the middle with that colored glass. You've got the seats coming in different directions, pointing at the central bima, that same color motif and the decoration over the ark. This was the small chapel that they built as well, with the same kind of structural motif for smaller services. Even the light installations were beautiful. The Ner Tamid, the eternal candle, hanging over the top. And here again, you get a distance view of the sanctuary. And again, imagine coming into this for ritual service, and you can even see on the right here that light blue circle. That's the kiddie pool collecting the water leaking in from the roof. And here again, a view from the bima looking out on the congregation. Again, a very striking view. And the other real highlight of the trip is a beautiful museum there. It's the National Museum of American Jewish History, built right on Independence Mall, where you have the Independence Hall itself. You've got the Liberty Bell, you've got the National Constitution Center, and then just to the side, you've got the National Museum of American Jewish History, which has documents and artifacts from the colonial period all the way through modern times. It's really a fascinating tribute to the lives Jews lived here. And again, remember, of those major cities today, how many of them are in America? One of just the top 10. New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago. 6 of the top 10 are in the United States. Well, that is a tribute to Jewish life and not just to Jewish past. Now, I mentioned we would touch on Israel. And as many of you know, I was planning another trip to Israel coming up this December. We had over 30 people signed up for it. Then, of course, everything went to hell, exploded, whatever metaphor you want to use. And so the trip was canceled. But I wanted to take you through the itinerary for that trip as sort of a closing thought, because it represents both looking at the Jewish past, but also trying to look at the Jewish present and potentially the Jewish future in better times. So this is our tour to secular Israel we envision taking. We would have landed on December 11th and gone right up to Jerusalem. We would have lit Hanukkah candles in Jerusalem. I mean, again, the experience of doing it there, not just being there, would have been very meaningful. We would do a walking tour of the old city of Jerusalem, led by both Muslim and Jewish guides who would offer their differing perspectives on some of the debated areas of the old city. We would have seen the Jewish quarter, the Via Dolorosa, which is the supposed route that Jesus took before his crucifixion, seeing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is a fascinating building, and of course the Western Wall and the major sites for Jewish heritage. We would have seen Israeli and Palestinian neighborhoods on the other side of the 67 borders, with a city called Ir Amim, the city of peoples, looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the border fence, how the neighborhoods are treated, and the inequities of the divided and yet not divided city. In the afternoon, we would have gone to the Israel Museum, which has both the life of Jews all around the world and in Israel, like that synagogue that you saw that picture of that has been rebuilt there. And we also would have seen the Shrine of the Book, which is where they house the Dead Sea Scrolls. Talk about the past, talk about Jewish communities that were destroyed. The community that wrote those scrolls was destroyed by the Romans centuries ago. We would have had dinner at a famous Jewish market called the Machane Yehuda Market to see what that experience was like, and again, meet living people, and also talk with an educator who runs a interfaith and interethnic coexistence program between Jews and Muslims to have them talk to each other, and even to have shared language and shared experience as a way to build peace. The next day, we would have gone to see Jewish history past the Dead Sea Scrolls caves where they were found, go up to Masada, that ancient fortress that was destroyed by the Romans in 73 of the Common Era. We'd have that lived experience of going to the Dead Sea and floating in the muddy, slimy salt water that's there. And then also visited an ancient synagogue in a modern kibbutz, and see one of our humanistic rabbis who works in a community called Ein Gedi. We would have then gone on to see some of the history of the founding of the State of Israel. Having looked at the conflict, having looked at the history, we'd go to Yad Vashem, the memorial to the Holocaust, see Mount Herzl, Israel's military cemetery. Again, not just ancient cemeteries, but modern cemeteries can be fascinating experiences. And then see an ordination of new humanistic rabbis taking place at a conference center in Jerusalem. We then would have left and gone to Caesarea, which is an ancient Roman city on the coast, seen an Arab Jewish cultural center in Haifa, which is a sort of a balanced demographic city, and seen the Wadi Nisnas market, which is an example of coexistence between Jews and Arabs in Haifa. We would have seen that ancient synagogue of Tzipori I mentioned on day 8, which is that where we saw that bar mitzvah being set up. We would have seen one of the first kibbutzim, Kibbutz Degania, on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, and then seen another kibbutz, which is an archive of the creative secular Judaism that Jews made over from the 1920s into the 1990s as secular Jews living in Israel, trying to create new holidays, life cycle events, and personal ceremonies. We were hoping to go into the West Bank as well. We would have seen a sort of new technocratic Palestinian city called Rawabi, seen a settlement called Pisagot, and then also visited the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, which we were able to do in 2019, but we probably won't be able to do for quite a long time going forward. Ultimately, we would have landed in Tel Aviv, learned about living Jewish culture through a adult Jewish learning institution called Alma College, tour the architecture of the Bauhaus that was built in the 20s and 30s and is now one of the best preserved locations for Bauhaus architecture in the world, and seen some of the history of Tel Aviv as well. And then finally visiting the Museum of the Jewish People, formerly called the Diaspora Museum, on our way out the door. So it would have been a fantastic journey through Jewish history and culture, Israeli development and history, the living present, the ancient past, and everything in between. Alas, not this time. Maybe next year in Jerusalem. We've said that before. But maybe it will be in the future, we'll be able to make that trip to see all those sites, to meet those people, and to have that experience. Well, with that, I've been talking for a long time. I'd like to stop and ask you if you had a place that you would want to go in the Jewish heritage touring category, where would you want to go, or a place that you thought you'd want to go that you just never made it around to doing? Or if you want to share a place you have gone that was a meaningful Jewish tourist experience, you can do that too. So either share your favorite Jewish tourist memory or your favorite Jewish tourist ambition of where you'd like to go sometime in the future. Yes, Steve.
Very interesting. Thank you, Rabbi. This is fascinating. And Judy and I have traveled a lot. And every place we go, we try to visit a synagogue or a Jewish site. Almost 30 countries we've been to, I think everywhere we've been, just about everywhere. Missed one in London. We were supposed to go to a Seder, but I got sick. My favorite Seder, though, this was in the 80s. I took a group of students to Mexico, to Guadalajara, and in Mexico, and we were there during Passover, and the parents made me promise if their kids signed up that we would have a Seder. Well, I found the Centro Comunidad Judío in Guadalajara, the Jewish Community Center. We had to go through speed bumps, gated gates. There were barbed wire all over the place and glass everywhere, on the top. Walked in, and everybody singing Avenu Shalom Aleichem. 150 people, mostly elderly. We had matzo ball soup, but of course they mixed the matzo balls with the gefilte fish and put them in the wrong place. So we had gefilte fish in the matzo ball soup. The experience was outstanding. The kids spoke enough Spanish. They spoke enough English that the kids got along. I had an incredible time. I still have the Haggadah. It was written in Buenos Aires, by the way. That experience, and an experience several years before that, when I was in Mexico City as a student, went to the Bazar Sábado, a Saturday bazaar. And it was a Jewish section. And I'm listening to the people. And like you said, you don't just go to see things, you hear things and feel things. And the most important thing that happened to me were two most important things. One, we're walking along and I'm listening to people mixing Yiddish and Spanish. Nu, ¿cómo estás? Absolutely unbelievable. And that same night, we went to see Fiddler in Spanish. Just unreal. So the experience is not just seeing things, looking at buildings. The experience is feeling, experiencing, talking, eating. In Rome, Judy and I had the artichoke at the near the old synagogue. Absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. So yeah, this is a great talk.
There's actually a debate because the Israeli rabbinate wanted to declare this particular artichoke dish that Roman Jews make as not kosher. And the Roman Jews said, BS, we've made this for centuries and we're going to keep making it. And you don't get to tell us what's kosher and what's not.
And the nice thing is you get to talk with people. The place we went to wasn't kosher, but inside the synagogue, I spoke my Spanish Italian, and Judy and I got lots of information. Just an absolutely beautiful experience. And the experience is, again, being with people and seeing people and talking.
Right. I will say, though, that as a rabbi, sometimes when I travel, I don't want to go to the Jewish Museum because it feels like work to me. Any other thoughts on either places you've gone, trips you've had, or places you've aspired to go? Yeah, Judy, go ahead. Well, wait, let's pick a non-Rosenzweig first. Yeah, go ahead, Irene.
Alan and I were just sitting here chatting too, and ultimately we would like to visit the Lost Jews
of New Mexico.
In New Mexico. And we love the Southwest area, and why we would really like to go to visit that area, especially to see and learn about the Lost Jews.
Great. Okay, Judy, go ahead.
I'm surprised that Steve didn't mention Morocco. Well, you mentioned a place where there used to be, but they kept the temple and we visited. And our place we were in was Curacao, where you wouldn't expect to see a temple, but we went in the temple in Curacao. So it's right in the area with all the shops. So we didn't have to take a special tour or anything. It was just right there. And a lot of these buildings, they just kept, even though the Jews are not a big presence, they kept the buildings. What we found, unfortunately, is that many places, they won't let you take pictures. So you really don't have you can't tell people, oh, we went to that synagogue. Oh, we have no pictures, because they won't let you take any pictures.
Yeah, well, and Steve mentioned the security guards, the fences, we're just starting to do that here, but in Europe and in Latin America, unfortunately, that's been a part of Jewish life for a long time, because they've had issues with terrorism and violence and so on, and we're now finally getting to that stage in the U.S., at least the early stages of it, we'll say. Yes. Anyone else want to share either a trip you took or a place you'd like to go?
Prague has always been a goal. We keep talking about going to Prague, finding ourselves a good golem. And at some point, especially with some family history in Hungary, it would be nice to go to Prague.
I was very jealous. Sherwin used to run these fundraising trips that cost several $1,000s because they were fundraising trips. But they would go to places like Krakow and Prague and Budapest, and it was very. I had to stay home and run the Shabbat services. He was taking these trips, but I was very jealous.
Yeah, Haifa sounds like an interesting place to me because there is a long-standing cooperation between Bremen and Haifa, and unfortunately, I wasn't on one of those schools who had an exchange program with Haifa, but obviously, because of all those cooperation things going on, one hears a lot about it here, but obviously with this current security situation, it might be a long-term aspiration.
Yeah. I mean, they're both port cities, which is interesting, and there's a beautiful Baha'i Gardens that are there because it's an important city for the Baha'i faith. And that's an interesting connection to Chicago because we have the only temple in North America. The only full Baha'i temple is in the Chicago area, and a beautiful building. We take it for granted because we drive by it on Sheridan Road all the time. But it's like a World Heritage site, and Haifa is another one with that connection.
David was talking about Prague, and you were just said something about Morocco, and Judy mentioned it. I did not mention that for a reason, but now I'll talk about a little bit. Morocco has made a point, the king there has made a point to restore as many Jewish buildings and synagogues and heritage sites that he can. And our tour guide, we were talking, and he said, I'm Berber, but I'm really Jewish. I said, why is that? Because the Jews were here first. They made Morocco what it was. So we were taken by that. And
yeah.
Our favorite story in Morocco is we're walking into the one of the synagogues in Essaouira and on the coast, and somebody walks up to the table in front that had shofarim on it, and he picks it up and starts blowing it. He's a rabbi from Toronto. We were inside on the balcony where the women are supposed to be, but we went touring inside, and all of a sudden we hear chanting inside. Several dozen people started davening. So it was unbelievable. Morocco is a great place to visit if you're into Jewish heritage.
Yeah. And there's still tens of thousands of Moroccan rooted Jews in Israel who make pilgrimages back there because they have a culture of saints and visiting the saints' graves. And so it's a real tourism attraction for them. And you're right, the Jews in Morocco generally were relatively tolerated there, unlike in some other North African and Middle Eastern countries. And so they often return in these sort of heritage pilgrimage tours. The one thing you have to be careful of, though, when you're doing Jewish heritage touring is people know that Jews do these tours. So, they might say, oh, you see that little hole in the wall? That was a mezuzah. And when you're in Spain. Oh, really? Well, maybe. Or maybe they cut the hole in to make it look like a mezuzah so they can claim this was an old Jewish house and now it's a stop on the tour. And, you have to be a little bit caveat emptor when it comes to Jewish touring, because, a market's a market.
Steve can help me with this. I know we were in Eastern Europe, and there was one place where the synagogue was part of like a building. You'd never know from the outside.
Vienna.
Steve, it was Vienna.
Vienna.
They did that so that, to keep people so they wouldn't, because the temples were destroyed during the war. They did this so that these Jewish people would be safe. It looked just like part of an apartment building or so. Until we walked in, I was like shocked there. And then it looks like you're in a temple.
Well, and that's actually very common in the Middle East, because part of the conditions for Jewish residents as a subordinate minority was they couldn't build their buildings too high or too ornate. So it would look relatively plain on the outside, but inside would be wonderful and beautiful. I think that the synagogue in Amsterdam is somewhat similar to that, which was also a Sephardic style synagogue, where the outside looks relatively plain, but you go inside and it's this beautiful ornate building, but you would never guess it from the outside. The idea
it was inside.
Yeah,
it was inside a courtyard of an apartment complex,
right.
And the street was blocked off at the top and the bottom, and we had to walk through a series of checkpoints to get in. And we went through a beeper, and the strange story was I beeped, and he said, "Unbuckle your belt buckle and kind of open your pants a little bit." And I was a little embarrassed, and I should tell you what I said. I said, "Are you looking to see if I'm really Jewish?"
Right.
You remember that, Judy?
Yeah, of course. I wasn't going to say it. Yeah, I wasn't going to say it, but yes.
I fixed it up for families.
Anyone else who hasn't shared something, either an aspiration or a meaningful trip?
Yeah, I can share. We went to Prague for a different reason, but we definitely took a tour of synagogues. There are 10 there. We went to 5 of them, if I remember correctly. I don't remember why we didn't go to the rest, but that was very educational, actually.
Yeah.
My aspiration is to go to Israel. Never been. I've been invited multiple times, and it doesn't look like. Actually, I was planning to go in 2024, but now it's kind of in the air.
Yeah. Well, and there are so many things to see there. That's one of those bottomless places to go when you're looking for Jewish heritage tours. But the other thing that we should always remind ourselves is that the Jews who went to those synagogues in Prague and Morocco, that was their daily life. That was their experience. They weren't doing it with the consciousness that this is going to become a heritage tour for somebody in later years. And they lived their lives. It wasn't just the cemeteries. It's not just the memorials. It's the marketplace. It's the opera. It's the private houses that they own. And so if you do Jewish heritage, I always try to say, don't just focus on the Jewish death. Don't just focus on the end. Focus on the life, how they lived, what they did, what they chose to do, and who they were. And then you'll have, I think, a more complete picture of these ancient Jewish communities.